Kirk, welcome back. It's been it's been a while since you've been on the podcast, so I appreciate you taking the time from your busy schedule to come talk to me about something you didn't even know what we're going to talk about. But yeah, how have things been? I guess for the listeners, in terms of since we last spoke, lots happened since then. You were able to share your story and the relationship with your dad, but today we're going to talk about the relationships we have with our sons. So it'll be a nice little circle.
It'll be perfect. Yeah. I think it's with Father's Day and everything else here. I think this is an excellent topic. I'm looking forward to it. Thanks for having
Awesome.
me on. Ah,
Yeah, anytime. So what's been going on in your life? Like what's new? What have you been up to?
yeah. Started a new job, which is exciting and good. I needed to make a bit of a move there just for my own mental health. The family wise, yeah, my oldest is about 12 years, just about to turn 12 at the end of this month, and my youngest is just about to turn 10 in August. It's been fairly eventful in that way. There's been definitely some challenges, along the line of learning some new things as a father and evaluating myself as a father to ensure that I'm providing the guidance that I think is appropriate.
Yeah, no, for sure. And last time we chatted, you shared your story, which you've talked about quite a bit in terms of not feeling any love for your boys, and that was something that you really had to get through, right? And what I've been able to see is that's something that you've really worked on and you've grown from it. So what's changed over the last few years in terms of just recognizing your role as a father and kind of the relationship you have with your boys now?
Actually, yeah, that's a great question. I think the most part is truly, in a lot of ways, where you start to see you and your spouse or the other significant person in your life through your kids. And as my kids are getting older, the most interesting part is I'm really starting to see how they are developing and taking some of the best parts of us and really amalgamating that into who they are in that time of their life. With my boys being approximately 2 years apart, it's really neat to see, the eldest kind of spearhead that and his ability to take on his own personality, and the youngest visually seeing this as a third personality within the house, taking a measure of all three.
Mm,
So I think for myself that way, it's it's now a mode of guidance more than what I maybe initially thought would be molding. I think they truly are who they are now, and it's how I'm able to influence the finer parts of their lives to make them hopefully the best individuals they can be.
mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And I guess one of the things, I've seen my son's going to be turning 11 here next month, and I think the biggest challenge for me was seeing that personality emerge, right? Him, his own person. And initially there was a lot of pushback, but now it's just interesting to see the ideas and the thoughts that come up in his little head and some of the things he says, right? And he cracks me up quite a bit because of his observations. And I think the challenge, as I mentioned, was around that innocence going away. Whereas everything was like he was so curious and exploratory and just like a sponge. And now he has opinions about things, and I'm just like, and sometimes we'll butt heads on these opinions where I'm like, no, you can't say that, or you can't think that way. But that's his life, right? And I have to
Yeah.
refrain from saying you can't, but rather than saying you can't, but like asking him to perhaps consider a different perspective and be like, hey, do you have space to look at it this way? And that's where I think, yeah, I think that's probably one of the things I've taken back from being a father as well.
Yeah, actually, I really like that statement. It's in some ways, me and my wife were actually talking about this yesterday, in the sense that she, she challenged me in a way where she's like, when you're talking to the youngest and myself, you talk about it in so matter of fact. It's you are to her and to him. It is less that I am listening and more dictating.
Mhm.
And so it was interesting because from my perception of what I was doing, I was debating and challenging, and it was they were overwhelmed maybe by my confidence in what I was saying. A wise man a week ago said to me and a few other gentlemen, you really got to meet people where they're at.
Yeah.
And so it really kind of hit me in that moment too, because it was very apparent in that moment where because the my kid right now is attempting to fit in and find himself and really develop himself in his own mind to find inner being, and
Mhm.
with me coming down on him so confident in my own personal thoughts, it's overwhelming him. So yeah, it was interesting in the sense where I truly had to say to myself, step back, because in a lot of ways, self-confidence comes from overcoming their own challenges, not me providing those challenges for him. And it was good for me to be checked by
Yeah.
both of them to be like, hey, like you're being a little much right now. Like,
Yeah.
have a breath.
Yeah.
It's good and encouraging me to be more well-rounded at the same time.
Hmm. Yeah, I think one of the things as you were sharing that, I was wondering because I just remembered something that took place with my son recently. It's where do you draw the lines? So you obviously want to challenge them, but where do you stop, right? For example, I'll just give an example. So my son's a big Edmonton Oilers fan. They're in the finals right now, but we were watching the second round a couple weeks ago, and he's like, "I don't want to watch the game because if they lose, it's gonna upset me." Right? And I'm like, "Well,
Yeah.
in life, you're gonna have a lot of difficult situations arise. You can't just avoid them. So
Yes.
you have to like sit with it, right? You can't just run away from it." So he actually internalized that, which I was really glad he did, and I felt good about it too. But we actually watched the game. Now his team was never behind, so that was easy. But the fact that he sat through with it, right? And I was kind of struggling at that moment, like, okay, I wanted to respect his wishes and not push him too hard, but I also didn't want to like back off and just say, okay, this is you can get away with this, right? This is how
Yeah.
you can approach difficult situations. So just curious, like in your experience, where do you draw the line and how much do you push? And I think there's with children, I try to be like, you have to pick your battles too, right? Sometimes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And but I think there's certain things that we shouldn't bend on. A great example that yeah, actually I went through 2 days ago. My son's in a very competitive wrestling group, and part of the training that's going right now is a lot of field training, so it's not as much wrestling as it is doing sprints and tire drags and everything else. And of course, it's just work. It's not fun and it's not play. So I was like, "Kate, yeah, let's get up and let's go. It's time to go to wrestling." And he's like, "I don't want to." And I was like, "Why don't you want to?" He was like, "It's not fun. It's not what I want to do. I'm not wrestling." But then I challenged him on the idea. This is an important part of wrestling, getting your fitness and working on that. So next year, as you're coming in and everything else, he's like, "Well, I can wait for next year." But it was in my mind, I was like, I get it in the sense that this is he's young, he's in it to
Hmm.
physically wrestle and be physical with the other kids. That's what he enjoys. So in my mind, there is that line where it's okay, I can give in and say, you know what, sure, we went in it to physically wrestle. You wanted to be in his mind and everything else. We had the conversations to be part of a very competitive group, and in turn, that actually means that there's a lot of training that goes along.
Hmm.
And much like in life, you can't necessarily choose your good days or your bad days. Everybody does have those bad days, and everybody has those
Hmm.
rough days. And I took that moment to make a stand of it and be like, if you he was living ahead in the future too, right? He was making too many assumptions of what the day was going to be. And
Right.
so in my mind, there's multiple lessons that can be learned here. We got to go into things with an open mind. We can't necessarily base everything on what may have happened the last time. We still have responsibilities, like he's given his coach the reassurances that he wants to be a part of this. We had a full-on blowout. Like he actually tore his shirt off like Hulk Hogan, threw it on the floor, telling me how much of a terrible father I am, how
Yeah.
I never want him to smile, I never want him to have fun, how I'm stupid and I'm an idiot and everything else. And of course, the biggest thing that I need to do with myself is to ensure that I'm in a position where I show him that A, you don't necessarily get away with saying stuff like that, but
Yeah.
B, my reaction to it at the same time.
Mhm.
So it became one of those full on life lessons. And in the end, he took some time and he went to his room. He thought about it. He came back out and he's like, you know what? Yeah, let's go. And then we ended up getting there. He sulked off and got on the field and had to do an extra set of push-ups or whatever else this coach made him do because he was late. And by the time he came back, he got in the car and I'm like, was that bad? And he's laughing. He's like, no, it wasn't that bad, but I would have rather been at home. And I was like, of course you have. But
Yeah.
uh, at the same time, it was a very difficult thing to go through because it was a full-on meltdown. We haven't had a full-on meltdown in several months, and it brought up a lot of guilt in myself. Like, am I doing the right thing? But I think the best thing for him was it was a boundary. He was able to try to push his limits. Yeah, I challenged him in that sense too to make a strong argument for why he shouldn't be going. And in the end, he realized that okay, that didn't work. Everything else, anger got the most of me. I went out. I actually did what was required. It wasn't as bad as I thought. Came back and we're good to go.
Yeah.
Right? But it was definitely one of those things where it was uncomfortable for both of
Mhm.
us. It challenged both of us. And I think for the most part, I feel good that he got more out of me challenging him than me letting him just get away with what he was doing. So there was more benefit to doing it, even though it was very difficult for both of us. Because in a lot of ways, too, I am the parent, I'm not his best friend. And I
Mhm.
think that is a key thing that we need to remember that we are there for their long term, not for the short
Yep. Absolutely.
bits in it. Yeah, there's
Yeah.
always times for that. In reality, we are setting them up for life in the world.
Mhm.
And which we can see is extremely difficult. And there
Mhm.
are a lot of people who are not prepared for how difficult that can be. And
Mhm.
if we don't challenge our children to dig deep and fight hard and find joy and find the positive in dark moments, then they'll never be set up to do such
Yeah.
things.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I mean, there's lessons in. I think most people, not only children, like want the outcome, but they
Yeah.
don't want to put in the work, the process, right? The cliche, you got to trust the process. But that's
Yeah.
essentially what it is, right? If you want to wrestle, you have to do all this physical workout so you're in shape and you have that discipline, right? That's another thing I think as fathers, we have to role model for our children, especially boys, is that discipline piece, right?
Yes.
And trusting the process. I remember like I took my son for a hike last year and it was a lot harder than I thought. And I'm shocked he did it. But there's so many times where he stopped, right? The first time he stopped and we're sitting there and I'm like, okay, you don't have to finish. And he's like, can we go back to the car? I'm like, no, we can't ditch the group we came
Yeah.
with. So I'm happy to sit here and wait for them, right? And then at one point I asked him, well, I'm like, I don't really understand. You're halfway done. You've done the hardest part. So why are you not wanting to do the rest? And he's like, all right, fine, let's go. And then he stopped 3/4 of the way again. And it was getting a bit sketchy at times. And then we're waiting. And again, he's like, can we go back to the car? I'm like, no, we can't leave the group. So there's a bunch of flies there. And he's like, oh, this is brutal. Let's finish this. And we actually finished the hike, and I remember seeing the look on his face, and he was just like, he felt so good about himself for accomplishing it.
Yeah.
And I asked him, I'm like, what did you learn today? And he's just like, oh, I don't want to have this conversation, but I think he learned a lot about himself, right?
Yes.
And I think those are the lessons that are so crucial and stay with them, right? And but I think that's our role as parents to demonstrate that and finding the right balance, not pushing too hard, but those lessons are important. Now, I do want to explore the whole wrestling bit because been I've seen the journey you've gone through with your
Hmm.
son, and I was also, I think one of the best heartfelt moments I saw was when your son was competing. You posted this video on Instagram, and he won, and he came straight to you, right,
Yes.
and like like jumped into
Yeah,
your
he truly jumped in my arms and just
yeah,
straight bawling. Like he was
yeah.
bawling. He had so much emotion coming out. Yeah.
And what was that like for you in that moment?
I think in that moment, I talk about this a lot, and I honestly believe this in a lot of ways that being a parent is 99.5% a lot of work and possible terrible moments. And that 0.05% is so magnificent and so perfect that it makes all of it worth it. And I think in that moment, seeing him, because he lost the match just before that, and he was really hard and down on himself. And then we sat there and we talked, and we were like, okay, you put in the time, you put in the effort. What do you know about this kid? You watched him wrestle over here, so he put this game plan in, and I said, how are you going to go in? What's going to be your first move? So we planned it out all together, and he was like, okay, I've got this, I've got this, I've got this. So it went from, I can't believe I'm here, I don't want to lose this again, and he had so much fear, and then watching him go in there, knowing you can almost see him trembling with the anticipation of what's going on because he's so afraid, but he's so jacked up at the same time. And then as he came through and all of that effort paid off, and he dug deep, he truly did. And visually seeing that, that was enough for me. He didn't even have to win. And then when he got the win and it was straight emotion and everything else, and he ran over and jumped in my arms, it was gratification for all of the hard times. All that 99.5% was just wiped out.
Mm,
And I think in the end, that is that's what it is to be a parent. But I almost think that is the icing on the cake itself, where the cake truly is the idea that throughout this hard work and the difficult parts really push us and our children push us to become so much better in our own eyes. So as I was sitting there and encouraging him to dig deeper and find the rest of it, I looked at my own life and I was like, okay, am I emulating this? Am I doing
mhm,
this? What am I doing for myself? I can't just be a hypocrite in doing this because I truly believe that, like you've said before, that we learn, our children learn from visually seeing what we do.
mhm,
So as I have those conversations with them, I'm like, have you seen myself do this? Have you seen your mother do this? Have you seen your brother do this? He said, yes. And throughout that, the joy of really being for myself, being a parent to a straight up boy who's been very difficult in regards to certain school structures and everything else, the the overall well-being he showed, the encouragement he showed, the the tenacity to work through that was validation for myself as well, like
mhm.
of myself, with myself. Not that it was very surprising for me in the sense where it's like I had so much relief at that same time. What I was going through was providing positive results because I think at times when they are they're going through those emotions and everything else and they're attacking you, it's so hard to say to yourself it's not personal
Mm. Yeah.
because in reality it's not personal. They have created something in their own imagination of what they perceive this should be being, and when it's not, you're the only person they can attack. And of
Mhm,
course you're the person they know the best,
mhm,
because you share your hopes and your dreams with them. They attack you in your hopes and dreams. And when you hear all this, to not take it personal at the same time, because that's the only ammunition they have, and they're feeling so much emotion that it then wipes all that away and creates that assurance that what you are doing is for the benefit of yourself, your family, your children, and everything else. And In a lot of ways, it's never perfect, of course. Some things work and some things don't.
Yep.
But for
Right.
me, it was like more is working than not.
Mhm.
That was, yeah, it was a wonderful event. And the hard part for myself now that that's occurred is to not just chase that event
Mhm.
again. Much like a heroin addict, that first initial high is the peak of everything, and then you chase that initial high over and over again.
Yeah.
I need to say to myself in moments like he's he now knows he can have so much joy because of things like this, that he hopefully I can encourage him to know that you don't need to reach that all the time. Life is about, it's the roller coaster. You get on and
Mhm.
off. There's ups and
Mhm.
downs, everything else, and it's to cherish those moments because they are so few of them throughout our lifetimes.
Mhm.
And so that's now my next lesson as we go through that. Hey, not everything is that moment,
Right.
and that's okay.
Right.
Life isn't supposed to be a perpetual high. Otherwise, we truly wouldn't have a full palette to paint the
Mhm.
pictures of our lives.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's again another crucial life lesson, because then to your point, you can be chasing that high and even delude yourself that, hey, if I put in the same amount of work, I'm going to get the same feeling at the end. And a lot of the times that doesn't happen, right? You can work your tail off and things may not work out, and then you can get discouraged, or you can take the lessons there and keep trying. But yeah, I think it's important to tailor those expectations, because it can easily be one of those things where, oh, if I do this again, if I work as hard again, I'm going to get that victory.
Yeah, and it's almost then changing the mindset from the win being the goal to the journey up to the win being the most important of that goal,
Hmm.
in the sense that the gratification of the hard work, the gratification of digging in deeper and being your best self, not the outcome of doing such things, but the physical act of working through that, the accomplishment of effort that
Hmm.
is truly the reward, because
Yeah.
that effort is paying off in more ways than a simple win or being on the top in this moment. It is that daily journey of being your best self, your true self.
Yeah, absolutely. And it hasn't been rosy the whole time, right? It's taken a while to get to this point. And again, I've been on the side of hearing it and witnessing it to a certain extent. What's this journey been like for you, and how has it been? Like last time you came on here, you shared how your father played a very significant role as
Hmm.
you were navigating childhood and some of the struggles you were having as a child. What have you taken from that, and how have you applied it with your own son?
Yeah, yeah. So my kid, the best way to describe him is he's a full-fledged boy. Of course, school systems, everything classify him as ADHD. He's got a bit of dyslexia in there. He's very self-aware, very emotionally intelligent in regards to being an empathetic individual. He sees a lot of emotion in other people. So for a while there, just due to the structure of the public school system, we were lucky if he was in school for the full week. 2:30 would come, and my wife and I would be praying that we didn't get a phone call from the school up to that point. If we made it through the day, we high-fived. It it put a lot of stress on our marriage, on our relationship with both of our kids. So there was a very uncomfortable time within that. And the biggest thing that we really saw was that we're responsible for that. We can't put any of this responsibility onto the healthcare system because it's overwhelmed, the school system because it's overwhelmed, the medical system because they are truly not trained in a lot of ways of
Mhm.
mental health or child psychology or anything like that. It's much easier to hopefully give your kid some medication and you settle them that way rather than working on the foundation to bring them to a point where they are productive in
Hmm.
society. So knowing that, looking back at how my dad parented me, which was a lot of empathy and unbridled love, and we had, of course, boundaries and everything else, but the boundaries were given with a lot of respect
Hmm.
and a lot of choice. He he listened uh, more than he talked in a lot of ways. He was able to really anticipate my moods and encourage me to understand my own feelings. And then he gave me the ability to make a choice and live out that consequence. Of course, he would be there so I didn't make terrible choices that
Yeah.
would affect me in the long term. But if they were definitely short term choices where something would be even more uncomfortable, he let me go through that. And I think in a lot of ways, I try to emulate that as much as I can in my own world. I'm not sure if I've done as good of a job in the sense where I was more of the type of the individual where I just sat and shut down. So I wasn't much of an issue at school. I just was there. I struggled in school definitely, but I was just there. Where my son is the opposite. He just gets up and leaves school. So he's just like, this place is boring. I'm done. I'm going home. I'm out. So it's in my mind, it was much more extreme because it's it's stressed out the family where one of us had to be available to go get him at a moment if the school called, because of course, unfortunately, the school is just not set up to be able to handle that. So even in those moments, I would head to the school. I would go in. I would be missing a meeting or two, and I would sit down with the principal, which we're now on first name basis. She's got my cell phone number and everything else, and I would walk in that room, and I could see to myself and him already that he was already feeling so much guilt and remorse for what he's done. No matter what I said at that moment, I wasn't going to do any good if I put more strain
Hmm.
on him. Like he was already harder on himself than any of us could have been. So I think in moments like that, I had to step away and provide him unconditional love in the sense that, hey, I'm here. I've heard you had an extremely difficult day. Let's get you home. Let's help you change that current feelings that you're having right now. The one thing I've learned is when he, especially my youngest, is in these modes, he's not in a position to learn or to listen or to understand when he's so focused and deep in these hurtful and resentful and shameful and guilty emotions. In order for me to really get through to him, it's I get him out of that situation. We change his current feeling structure, and then when he's in a position to have that discussion where he can actually absorb some of the stuff we're saying, that's when the difficult conversation I have with him. And I
Hmm.
think that's worked really well. A Because before, like I was saying at the beginning of the pod, I was more talking at him,
Hmm.
not at his level, but what I thought he had to hear, but he wasn't in a position to hear.
Right.
So over this last little bit, I've had to step back and be much more like my father in a sense where he's not in the right position, meet him where he's at, move him to a position where he can accept some of this criticism or discussion and internalize it to then make his life hopefully better or in a state where he's able to work through a lot of those emotions rather than having the current outbursts that he's been feeling at that
Hmm.
time.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think, what I was able to observe was you were obviously trying to educate yourself and learn more in terms of how you can parent differently.
Yes.
Yeah. At times, I can imagine it was discouraging, right? Because you would try something, or at least you would feel like you're trying all these things, but nothing was really landing. So, how were you able to continue with that sense of patience and keep going through that trial and error process to see what would actually land? Because, for a lot of people, unfortunately, medication is the solution or the route they take, and that kills a lot of the it solves the problem in the short term, but it has other unintended consequences. And but that was not something you looked at, right? You were trying to find something that was more finding a solution that would work for him.
Yeah, in the long term, yeah. So we went through and we tried a number of different things, and some of the biggest things that we started to see some success through were through neurofeedback therapy.
Mhm.
So it is a therapy where they measure the brain waves in stimulating the frontal lobes to increase one's awareness and cognitive sense to control and regulate their current state. For him, his temporal lobes tend to be overreactive without breaks, so he tends to be extremely emotional that way. So we worked with a group where we would come in and do an hour's worth of therapy where he would come in and learn to stimulate that part of his brain. And then actually I bought a machine, and it's called Focus Calm, and we use it at home where he's taught himself to meditate.
Mhm.
And it's interesting because I don't think there's one strict way that works. I think you need to take everything from multiple angles. If it's medication, great. If it's not medication, great. But don't leave it at that. Essentially, this is something you need to look at holistically, primarily in a lot of ways, in the sense that much like your son when he was going on the hike, I think the hardest thing for my son is when he doesn't have that extra stimulus and he's forced to sit and think about his own actions, or when there's nothing there to defer him from his own thoughts, where he has to sit with his own thoughts. And so I think in a lot of ways that by doing this meditation and everything else, it's given him the ability to be comfortable with himself, or
Mhm.
learn to be comfortable with himself. And the other big thing that we do is a lot of breathing exercises, relaxing his central nervous system, his ability to breathe, nasal breathing, and different breathing techniques and methods, and timing. And you'll see, I now see him being in certain situations where he'll get home and something won't be right and he would have flown off the handle, but he'll take himself out of the moment, and I can see him having three deep breaths and then coming back and being like, okay, and approaching it slightly different. And usually, if it doesn't work that way, or the third time, then we have all out loss. But it's been such an incredible journey from that immediate, hey, I've been trying to remind you, we're getting close to bed, and outright flip the table. You know, life is garbage. I hate myself. You're terrible parents. To now he's like, okay, can I do this? Can I do that? Now, and what I like about that is, in some ways, he knows the boundaries there, but he's still going to challenge me in some ways. And I don't want to take that out of him because I don't want him to just be compliant either. I
Mhm.
think we need to raise our kids to be thoughtful about why things are needed and everything else. And he still gets to the point where he's, I guess it is what it is. Like he may not accept it at that moment, but I don't want to beat that challenge out of him. And that's definitely a line that we're really trying to push for his self-confidence. But yeah, so to get back to the question there, we've had to look at it in a number of different ways. So for myself, I know that I need to emulate what I want to see within him, and it had to be universal. My wife had to be on the same plate in the sense that we both had to be mirroring the attitude and the regulation that we wanted to see in him. Uh, when it was inconsistent between both of us, we still had a lot of problems.
Mhm.
So at that time, it created a lot of difficult questions and conversations between us. And I think in a lot of ways, it's definitely had. I see how in a lot of ways this could tear apart relationships in some
Mhm.
ways. But the neat part about what happened with myself, neat. The interesting part about what happened between myself and my wife is we looked at each other and we made the decision, like, this is the work we want to do. We know that this isn't ideal for our relationship right now. However, we both want this goal for him, and well, by working on it, it's actually made our relationship a lot closer because we have very similar values, and by pushing that value chain into him consistently in a method that we are both comfortable doing, he's had the strength, and we've actually gone back to a much more secure relationship that way at the same time.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. It sounds like the wrestling, right? You got to put in the
Yes,
work.
you put in the work. Yeah.
For sure.
And it's uncomfortable, really, because
Yeah.
in a lot of ways, your significant other is your release. And when you're in a situation where they turn the opposite of that, they turn into someone you're having conflict due to something you need to outlet, much like your child is you're their only outlet. Usually your significant other is really one of your only outlets, and then you're at each other, and that's all in the same house. It's extremely difficult.
Mm-hmm.
So when you sit down and you go through the goals of what you're trying to do, and the biggest thing I think was putting our humility out there and vulnerability out there to say, the vanity and everything else, this is not what I want. Of course, nobody wants to go through any of this. Nobody wants to be a part of. You don't become a parent and think that, especially someone for myself, where people look at us and like, oh, you do men's mental health, you sit around with groups, and turns out your kid's a complete asshole. And it's like, ugh, you're like, oh, holy moly! I thought I'd be much better at this.
Yeah.
Aren't I supposedly the guy that people come talk to have these conversations? And I put my pants on one leg at a time like everybody else. And
Yeah.
it's being humble in those moments to be like, this is what life is, right? This is part of the journey. To be humbled and sit there and be like, okay, yeah, this is what it means to be human,
Mm-hmm.
right? We're all going to create these situations where we're going to run into disappointment and errors, and we're going to make bad decisions with good intentions, and it doesn't matter. What matters is, like we always say, how you react to this,
Mm-hmm.
how you get up and how you push forward. And so looking at each other and having that conversation, and it wasn't like, hey, this is what we're going to do, we got to push forward. It was just that honesty, like it was heartfelt in a way where it was like, I can't do this anymore. I'm emotionally drained. I thought I was doing better. I thought we were doing better. And
Yeah.
then getting that out on the table where you're not hiding in your sadness and in your emotion alone. You're recognizing that you're both going through this. It is difficult for you both, and you are providing empathy to each other in these moments of distress, and then bringing the family together in that, to being like, hey, we're doing this together. This
Yeah.
isn't an individual battle. This
Right.
isn't all on you. Like, he's 9 years old. Like, I can only imagine that this is his whole world, right? I don't want him to feel like he's in charge of all of these emotions or has this much sway on all the family's emotions. Like, how much pressure is that for the poor guy taking a seat to look at him as an individual and be like, we can't be doing that to him either. We've got to show up as a cohesive unit to really do this, and to be real about it. Like, it's ugly at times. It's okay to say to each other, I got to take a walk. Like, Tag, you're in. I'm not doing my best for him, and I need your help. And being vulnerable in those moments, and rather than, this is how we do it, and let's stand up and everything else. It's okay to take off the mask with each other and get back in the ring when you can.
Yeah, and I think being on that same page, like you said, is so crucial because if you're on the same page, he can internalize that too. Whereas if you guys weren't, then that would just make his whole world, like you said, a lot more difficult for him to manage and navigate from that perspective. The other piece you touched on, even those little skills like the breathing exercises and all of that, they're going to serve him so much as he grows older, right? So these are all again very important skills that we didn't learn as children, but so important that we're passing them on to our children. And then you touched on being involved in the space where you're part of groups, you're having these conversations. How has that helped you with all of this? Like, has there been an aspect of it that you've been able to take back home? Whereas if you weren't involved in these ways, it might have been a bit more difficult to manage this situation.
Absolutely, absolutely, and 100%. And in the sense too, like in my family, my dad always calls me the hub of the wheel.
Hmm.
Like you're the foundation for the family and everything else. And subconsciously, that puts a lot of pressure on me, given how my dad's current mental health is and everything else. So I always feel that I can't show, and that's a lot of it's just subconscious that I placed on myself. Like I'm here to ensure that not only is my family taken care of, but my family, as in my parents and my brother and sister, that they're being taken care of. That I'm the one that they can come to and say whatever, and I will be there for them. And the best part about this group and where it's really given me space to breathe, is probably the best way to put it, is I can sit in a room with a group and owe them nothing and they owe me nothing, yet still at the same time share a moment of distress and commonality that we might not have the same exact issues, but we have all felt this way at some point, and to know that you're not alone in that feeling. And the best part about it is everybody has a personal discussion on how they've gotten through that, and so you're able to gleam off small bits of this and really change your perspective in a much healthier way rather than simply internalizing it and almost doing that root of insanity. Because when you're strictly talking to yourself, you're really saying the same thing over and over again and trying to get a different result. Where the benefit of being part of a group is, there is someone there who is going to be thinking about this different, uh, in a different fashion or in a different view, and knowing that, you know, that this isn't your wife or your father or your mom or whoever else in that moment, that you can just look at it as someone from a third party looking in, or just advice or anything else, and your guard's not up or anything else at
Hmm.
that point. It For myself, I've gotten way more from it than I ever thought I would. Like I said, I consider myself a very well-adjusted individual, and through this, it's like that. What do they say? A wise man realizes how much he doesn't know, or the idiot thinks he knows everything. So I always find that I was so lost in the dark of my own thoughts, feeling that I had already learned so much to only realize that I've just been scraping the surface of this. And the reality of what's going on now is I've taken all that I've learned and now seeing the beauty and how it applies to so many other things. So
Hmm.
it's a gateway to true experience and true knowledge, because you're now more open to all of these things. And I would have only been that way by being a part of a group that was so vulnerable, that was willing to just put it out there and leave their egos at the door.
Hmm. Absolutely. I think I've said that too, where very similar to yourself. I think when you and I first started this group, I had this view that, oh, this is something I'm doing for the community, I'm giving back. But as we started getting involved, different points coming out of the pandemic, going through some other personal struggles, I've taken so much out of it. And I think we were talking even earlier this week in terms of trying to explain the feeling we have when we're in nature of just being held and
Mm-hmm.
having that sense of comfort. That's how I felt, because last year, as you know, I was going through probably most difficult time in my life, and I had some emotional moments and I just felt held, right? And I
Yeah.
had this community of guys I can call brothers that I could just be myself with, and just open up and let it all out. As much as I felt uncomfortable after the fact, but it did serve a purpose, and I don't think I would have had that otherwise.
Yeah, yeah. And maybe even for your listeners, I'm not sure if you wanted to talk about that or not. Like, I am very lucky in a way that, you know, my wife and everything else, we're all on the same page, we're in the same house and everything else, where you're going through a different journey because you're not in the same house, let alone you're having challenges that are very similar, and you're definitely on a propelled direction of self-learning and self-awareness, and you're trying to model that best as possible, but you're at a bit of a disadvantage because it's not full-time.
Mhm.
Like, how is that working in your life in a sense like that?
Well, I mean, it was something that you said last year around that time, where I often get trapped in this mindset that I have such a limited time when my son's visiting, right? And as much as I try to reframe that, saying it's not about the quantity, it's the quality. How can I create those moments? And you also reemphasized that for me, and that really stuck with me. So I've really changed my perspective now when my son's here, and when we do have those moments where things get difficult, and he says certain things, and I try not to take it personally, as hard as it is, because a lot of the times these things happen, we fix it, we talk about it, and he's gone, and then there's a void, right? And those days are the hardest, when he leaves, because yeah, it's hard, right? Like, it's like a piece of my heart is just gone.
Yeah,
And I think for me, yeah, it's just recognizing that I've been fortunate enough, and I'm grateful that I've been able to understand certain things from a different perspective. And time is not what we actually comprehend it to be, right? And I've, through this experience, it's allowed me to open up and have a deeper spiritual connection. And I truly believe that um, it doesn't end here. So,
yeah,
some people might call me, like the cynics might call me delusional, but I'd rather live with that than not, right? And it's peace. And if that's not the case, that's fine. At least I lived my life with meaning and purpose. But I truly believe this is not where it ends. So how can I've started looking at, in a way, that my son and I are meant to be in this situation together, because we are serving a purpose in each other's life, and we don't see it all the time. So yeah, that's kind of how I've tried to navigate it, and then how can I be the best version of myself. And I think one of the things, when he moved away, that was the promise I made to myself and him, not directly to him. I didn't express it, but the best thing I can do for both of us is the best version of myself. And so when he's gone, I'm working my tail off to be the best I can be. And then when he's here, he gets to experience that best. Now, I'm still human, I still make mistakes. But what I try to remind him anytime I make a mistake is that, hey, I want you to know, because no one ever told me, that it's okay to make mistakes, and it's okay to apologize, and it's okay to fix that, because that's what we do.
yeah.
And I hope that lands, and he recognizes that, and he sees his father as someone who's always trying his best, and when he's not doing his best, he's still trying to take the lessons and learn from it.
Yeah, it's that sense. What I love about that is that kind of goes along with what I was saying earlier, and you took that on as well within that statement. The work, as you're putting it in, is difficult. It's hard and everything else, and you might not see that finish line, or you might not even know what that finish
Mhm.
line looks like.
Right.
But knowing that work is actually occurring and everything else, no matter what the outcome is, being that best version of yourself by putting in that work is truly that end goal. How I think most people say that, or my dad even might have told me when I was young, what you do while no one is looking is the most important
Yes.
part of your life because that truly sets your character. And I think the older we get and the wiser we get, when we see people who actually do that, those become, at least for myself, those become my heroes. And this
Mm-hmm.
is that's how I want to live. And when I know that someone is out there doing it, and I agree with what you said there in the sense that it might be delusional to some, but anybody who lives long enough realizes that we're all in some sort of delusion, right?
Yeah.
You know, what we see at face value is never truly what things are. So why not choose your delusions that suit who you are to be the best version of who you are? And I use delusions very loosely in the sense that it's a common term, but
Mm-hmm.
it could be your value system, your faith, anything else. If it truly makes us better individuals, not only for ourselves, but for our family and for our communities and everything else. That's what why would you ever let anybody take that away from you?
Mm-hmm.
Or why would you ever bring anybody else down for doing such things? We always try to find these situations where we're being right. And I think the best part of having these conversations and everything else is knowing that there is no true sense of only being right or only being wrong. It is continuous lessons on how to become better.
Mm-hmm.
That there might not be a right and there might not be a wrong, but there certainly is a better choice.
Mm-hmm.
And in taking the effort to make that better choice, even though we don't do it all the time because we're human, but the more we fight for and the more we take those steps and we get uncomfortable and we do that extra bit of work, the easier that becomes and the more work we find ahead of us. And at that point, we really start to see, and I see it in myself, I find a lot more joy and true happiness where I have unlimited reasons to smile in moments where I rather felt nothing or I felt empty.
Yeah.
And it's
Absolutely.
through that work that I now recognize such things. I understand what it means to truly be grateful, as cliche as that sounds. And I was always like, oh, yeah, everybody says this. Until you find moments where you really do feel welcome and happy with who you are in the moment where you're at because you know you've given everything in that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think for me, I'm also grateful because, as again, going back to the quantity over quality, what
Yeah.
I've experienced is the purest form of love.
Yeah.
And if I experience that for 4 days in a month, that's a lot when you think about it, because some people never experience it. So I'm grateful to experience that, right? And it's all about your perspective. And as you were sharing that, I think it's where you aim, right? The higher you aim, the harder you have to work. And you can choose your hard, right? You can choose hard work or you can choose a hard life. And I've
Yeah.
chosen both, and I prefer hard work. So, and yeah, I think that's what it comes down to is, again, we get lost in, we're so attached to outcomes and we're attached to the things we want. And, I've said this before, but the Buddha said the root of all suffering is attachment, right? And trying not to attach to it, just accepting what's coming at me and whatever's happening for me. And this experience has taught me so much. And
Hmm.
I wouldn't be where I am today if it wasn't for this experience. So I can't really get upset about it, as hard as it can be, because it's continuing to teach me and it's forcing me in a way to be a better me.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that. I like that because it in a way that truly says that life is not an outcome. It is the journey. So
Mhm.
we may think we're working towards a single outcome of X, Y, or Z, but in reality, it's how we go through life and model our perception about our immediate experience, about being in that present moment and what that means to us and what we're doing to ensure that that present moment is felt in the best form possible through the work and the direction in which we're fighting for it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And our kids, hopefully, at some point, through those actions and everything else, and through those discussions, and through the vulnerability, and through the honesty, and the moments and the time spent when it's there, and you find those moments that they are able to feel that as much as they see it.
Hmm. That, I mean, you can hope for that, right? But you
Mm.
can't control it, unfortunately. And they're all on their journey, right? And that's the other thing. I again, for me, at times I would get fixated on, okay, well, what's going to happen? Like, what's his future going to look like? But I can't control that. You know, he's his own person. And we started the conversation this way in terms of seeing them as individuals that they're becoming. And yes, there's parts of the mom and parts of the father in the child, but then they're morphing into something completely different. And that's in itself is a beauty of creation, right? Like,
Yes.
going back to the nature kind of reference, when we're out there, we see everything kind of, and I said this, you know, an individual that came on the podcast said everything in nature is in complete surrender. And that's what makes it so beautiful and peaceful. We are, right? When we're in complete surrender, that's when we're at our best and feel the most peace.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And maybe even to define that for myself, a complete surrender is accepting the moment for what it is, giving up to the reality of that moment. For me, is complete surrender. Not like I had some person ask me like, "Oh, you always talk about surrender, but that just means you're doing nothing. You're surrendering." I was like, "No, it's quite the opposite. In
Yeah.
a sense, it's for me, it's not surrendering to something like that. It is surrendering to all that I'm feeling and being honest with what's going on and accepting everything that's happening within that moment for the truth of that moment and how that makes me feel or enlightens me or puts me in a perspective, surrendering to that and then saying, okay, this is really what's happening right now, looking at that objectively, and then making choices to move to the direction I want it to go to. Uh,
Yeah, and that's more work than anything else, right?
oh,
You actually have to change and look at things differently and change all the things you're used to. And majority of the times, it means you're stepping into uncertainty and discomfort. And we
yeah,
are creatures that like our comfort. So it is a lot of work to surrender from my perspective too, because
it,
I think
it's
there's
exhausting.
it is, but there's an aspect of where your faith is suspended, right?
Mhm.
You're believing in something that you don't know is going to happen, and that takes a lot of courage too.
It is. And I think that's where we are all common. We just call it different things. There is a courage in the unknown, in your, rather from your atheist to whoever. We all take this leap of faith
Hmm.
that whatever that viewpoint is true for us.
Hmm.
And we make decisions based on that. And I would encourage everybody to look that within that, we got to be honest and surrender to the reality of what's happening within those moments. And the funniest part is I I don't necessarily call myself a religious man, but I would definitely call myself a spiritual man after that because I've been in so many situations now where now the how would I even best put it, by surrendering to the energy and everything else that's going on in that moment, I'm able to find clarity that regular answers cannot provide,
Hmm.
or the I need to accept the unknown as a substantial influence within my life. And what that unknown is can be many different things for many different people. For some, it's a religious sense, and for others, it is past work or whatever that else that they may have put themselves in.
Yeah.
But in reality, in the end, it's they need to accept that they do not know where this strength comes from
Hmm.
or where this purpose of direction comes from. And as they sit into it and they start to experience things, that's where that growth comes from. And I think the more I lean into that, the more I find space for this the struggles of my kids and my wife and my friends and my family. And I'm grateful for such things. So yeah, that's not a way to tie it in, but yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I agree with you. Kirk, it's been a pleasure doing this. I know we talk a lot, so this is new
Yeah,
for us, but thank you for coming on. Super grateful for you taking the time to do this. It's an honor to have you in my life and call you a brother. So I very much appreciate anytime you're able to do this stuff for me.
absolutely, my friend. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Oh, by the way, before we finish, who's
Yeah.
got still has the highest score on the neurofeedback machine?
Actually, you don't anymore. You've been taken over.
All right.
Actually, Walker has the highest.
All right. I'm glad to hear that.